Metroid Dread is a game that, if I'm honest, kinda caught me by surprise. I'm sure it was leaked to the moon and back, but I wasn't exactly paying attention, so its surprise reveal earlier this year caught me a little by, well, surprise. Metroid as a series, specifically the main line of 2D titles, is really interesting. It's been around for 35 years and has only had 5 entries. That's an average development cycle of 7 years, often skipping generations, jumping from home consoles to handhelds to home consoles, but it's kind of a handheld. Needless to say, it's a far cry from anything developed by EA Sports. But it's also got a pressure on it that not many other series have. Metroid Fusion released coming up on 20 years ago. Like, that's not a joke, that's actually how long it's been since a new game in the 2D Metroid series. And in some ways that's good. I mean, it's better to have 4 games ranging from good to incredible rather than 10 mediocre ones. But on the other hand, it's a shame, because Metroid games are a fucking gift. At their peak, they create genres, and even at their trough, they are still really good. Metroid as a series has a legacy that is unmatched in the industry. It's never been as popular as the heavy hitter franchises, but no series has quite the reverence that Metroid creates. And look, I love me some Prime, especially Prime 2, and I'm sure Prime 4 will be great when it releases the same day that the sun collapses, but it's never been close to my boy Super Metroid. And given that a 2D Metroid hasn't released pretty much in my living memory, can Metroid Dread really live up to that legacy? Does it deserve to proclaim itself as Metroid 5? Well, unfortunately, the answer's a little more complicated than yes or no, but if you need a simple answer, mine would be no. Well, it's closer to it depends, but that doesn't make for a good hook into a video, now does it? The first important thing to note is that the game wasn't developed by whatever the modern equivalent of Nintendo R&D 1 is, which was the division at Nintendo that worked on all 4 of the previous titles. For one, that studio doesn't exist anymore, and for 2, the game was mostly developed outside of Nintendo by Mercury Steam, the team that made Samus Returns for the 3DS, similarly to how Retro Studios worked with Nintendo to make Prime. I was not a fan of Mercury Steam's take on Metroid 2, which seemed both vague in its direction and lacking an understanding of what Metroid 2 was supposed to be, instead taking all of their ideas for a remake of Fusion and grafting them onto a game that originally had a very different structure and tone. Metroid Dread is a substantial upgrade from Mercury Steam's previous work, but it still feels a lot more like a sequel to Samus Returns rather than Fusion and Super in its look and feel. A lot of the art style is taken from that game, and a lot of the gameplay has been lifted from it as well, the 360-degree aiming and melee counter being of note. But with a fresh foundation, more time, better hardware, I assume a higher budget, alongside guidance from Nintendo EPD, they've managed to take the elements that worked in isolation from Samus Returns and refine them into a package that better suits all of them in turn. But, as I'll get to near the end of the video, that vague direction from Samus Returns is still present. It's better, in part due to not also being viewed through the lens of a different game, but the lack of mechanical focus that results in means that it's difficult for the game to be very unique. Mercury Steam has improved a great deal, but they've just kind of improved through the level of competence as the rest of the series, and haven't managed to bring that all together into a focused, directed whole, and so what we get are a bunch of elements that are quite good, but don't stick together all that well, and also some very minor, atrocious decisions. But first, with the good stuff. Combat on the whole is really solid and challenging in a way that feels surprisingly fair. Now, I say surprising from my perspective because I like to think I'm pretty good at video games, but really I'm just kind of average, so whenever I die my brain tends to find anything to blame but myself because I'm really good at video games, there's no way I could die. But in Dread, I never really felt that, and I died a fair number of times. Boss design especially has taken a great leap forward, all with unique and interesting fight dynamics that force you to battle in a variety of ways. And even during regular gameplay, the grunt enemies all feel like they've been designed to uniquely challenge you, not just by moving differently, but by being designed to each pose different challenges. It's especially a leap forward from Samus Returns, where the melee counter was used somewhat as a catch-all that interrupted the pace quite a bit, but here the melee counter is only the optimal strategy in a small number of cases, so it feels much more like a combat tool rather than just being the combat in its entirety. But back to bosses, their design makes for some really dynamic and kinetic fights, and I think a lot of that comes down to the new dash. Being able to quickly move left or right was never really an option outside of the speed booster, which wasn't very helpful when you're locked in with something trying to stab your face off. But the dash means that your evasive capabilities have been greatly improved. Not only can the bosses be more aggressive in turn, but it also gives you a bit of leeway because you can quickly remove yourself from a situation if you realize at the last second it's the wrong place to be. During fights, you're generally encouraged to be more mobile, but you also have ample time to retaliate. Because aiming requires you to be stationary, you cannot both evade and be dealing the sustained amount of damage at the same time, so bosses need to have space in which you don't have to move, and there is always some time in a boss's attack pattern where you don't have to move. And throughout the game, that time will get shorter and shorter, but it will always exist, and it won't always feel like that time is just when they're waiting to do their next move. Attack wind-ups, long-firing stationary moves, you never feel like the boss isn't giving you time to attack, but it doesn't feel like that time is being handed to you either. But then we have melee counters and boss fights. Fuck me, we were on the verge of greatness, we were this close. But then Mercury Steam goes and pisses it all away. Melee counters are used in bosses in two different, yet equally boneheaded ways. The first is the same way they were used in Samus Returns, to transition into these impressively animated but completely flow-breaking moments where all you do is spam missiles and wait for the cutscene to end. I feel if they acted in the same way that they do with enemies, giving you a really powerful attack to counter with, it would be really cool, a nice reward for baiting an enemy's attack, but as they are, they're way too flow-breaking. The other way is as a finisher, which would be great if it wasn't the only way you could finish some fights, but when a boss has a counter finisher, it's the only way that fight will end, which can feel kind of cheap in some instances. Okay, I might be being hyperbolic when I say that the design decisions were boneheaded and that they pissed all the good stuff away, but neither edition feels like it really enhances boss fights. They just feel kind of tacked on, and given how excellent the rest of the design is, that's kind of frustrating. But to be honest, they aren't really that bad, I just like complaining, so on the whole, the game has some excellently designed combat. But what about the design the rest of the time? I want to have a little chat about the game's primary gameplay draw, its killer feature, or at least what all the marketing says that is. Look, here they are, right on the box. The EMMIs. I know the game calls them Emmys, but I'm not doing that to myself. I thought the EMMIs were a really cool idea. Add some tension, maybe some new interesting gameplay ideas born from the fact that you're always being chased by an enemy that completely outguns you. But the truth is, they barely matter, and past the first playthrough, any sense of dread evaporates and they just kind of become a nuisance. I imagine that the idea for the EMMIs came from the SAX from Fusion, which was a similar idea, an enemy that you can't even damage until the final moments of the game. However, the EMMIs struggle in a few key areas to have the same level of terror that Fusion made. First off, they are very easy to avoid. I don't mean the parries that you can do to escape them once they grab you. They are very difficult, and rightfully so. It's not a move that you expect to pull off, so when you do, you're not quite prepared, and that's a great way to build tension. But once they see you, it's far too easy to just run away. If you just don't stop moving, you'll probably be fine, and given the very fluid and responsive controls, it's not a big deal to just not stop moving. It's also impossible to stealth your way around them. Sure, you can use the Phantom Cloak, but it doesn't last long enough to be useful to navigate around them, only to hide when you've accidentally backed yourself into a dead end. As for the rest of the time, their hearing is too good, so if you're remotely in their range, they'll just run straight towards you. So there's no point in trying to sneak around them. And then the major draw. You kill them way too quickly. You can have 4 out of 7 dead in 2 hours, about a quarter to a third of the way through the game. It's difficult for them to build tension when you know they'll be killed not long after you see them. They're generally just too weak, dispatched too easily, not challenging to avoid, and they never really challenge your creative problem solving. I mean, you kill all 6 fully functional EMMIs in exactly the same way, and even their special ability doesn't factor into how you have to approach them come the Omega Cannon. I like that they're only allowed to roam specific areas, and that those areas are clearly marked as EMMI zones, but I only like that because the rest of the map would be a nightmare to have to avoid them, given how tight the areas are when you're outside an EMMI zone. The game wants you to think it's the scary, tension-filled experience, but that idea conflicts with the general exploration of the game. It didn't have to, but because they want you to be able to explore like it's Super Metroid, mechanics that would have you being constantly on edge would conflict with that. And so, they aren't willing to commit hard enough to this idea, the thing the game is named after. Instead, they just become something that gets in the way of you going where you want to go, something that became especially apparent when I went through the game a second time. During my first playthrough, I was kind of playing along a little bit with the game, so wandering into an EMMI zone was genuinely a little tense. But second time round, I already knew where I wanted to go, so being mildly inconvenienced by a lumbering fuckwit of a robot just made me frustrated, not tense, not any kind of dread. From what I gather, Project Dread, which was the prototype for this game that was workshopped sometime after Fusion, was built around this idea of having to navigate around an enemy that you cannot fight and turning that into a mechanic rather than a set piece. But in actual Metroid Dread, that mechanic effectively becomes an afterthought, something to slap on that doesn't enhance but only pads the game. On the back of the box, it reads, "Fear lurks around every corner. How will she cope with the dread of isolation?" It's funny, because that perfectly encapsulates Metroid 2, a game that they failed to understand, but does not describe in any way any feeling that I had playing this game. I wasn't a big fan of Samus Return's 2.5D visuals. To me, the limitations of creating 3D graphics for the 3DS limited their creativity in a way that pixel art wouldn't have done. And also, given the translation from pixel art into 3D models, there were some effects that didn't seem to translate at all, the space jump and the screw attack in particular feeling almost unfinished. Things are much improved in Dread, with backgrounds especially being far more visually interesting, with a lot of depth communicated without it seeming strange that you can only move on a single plane. The effects on the whole are also much improved. Special mentions go to the much improved screw attack that more than makes up for the still kind of piss space jump. Like, I get that translating this to a 3D model is probably not easy, but at least try and do it. It's okay though, because like I said, the screw attack looks great, and it replaces the space jumps animation anyway. There's also a lot more variety here than was previously shown in Returns, which was pretty much just various caves, and while I get that was kind of the aesthetic of Metroid 2, I think AM2R did a much better job of translating that game's visuals into something more appealing without losing their effect. Dread has a lot of unique looking backgrounds, and while the theming of these places might be a little more generic than I'd like we've got Lava World, Cave World, Water World, Plant World, that's never something that really bothered me too much. What did bother me is that Mercury Steam has decided that they really like cutscenes. Cutscenes are not inherently bad. The Primes managed to get away with them pretty well, but here they're so unnecessary they border on intrusive. Do I really need to see that this eye-boy is looking at me 3 separate times? Do we need to fuck the flow of this boss fight just to watch him grow wings? The cutscenes in Dread often don't serve a purpose, or more accurately, that purpose is not necessary. Like, for example, the spam missile cutscenes and fights are supposed to make you feel really cool and badass, but because you're not controlling them, they don't work and only serve to break the flow of combat, and ironically can break the feeling of being badass that you might actually feel from fighting these bosses. Or there's the cutscenes associated with the EMMIs, like the 15-second acquiring Omega Cannon cutscenes, or the 20-second absorbing power-up cutscenes that play every single time you properly encounter one, and are exactly the same each time. We don't need to see this again, I've seen it before, so stop wasting my fucking time. Things that could be defined in environmental interaction, or just be animated during gameplay, but instead are given dedicated cutscenes, completely shatter the flow state of playing the game. And it doesn't happen all the time, sometimes it's really seamless, but that effort clearly wasn't applied everywhere. What I can say is that they're animated well, even if the result of that animation is less than the sum of its parts. The animation team is clearly talented, putting a lot of detail into all the game's animations, from the enemy attacks, to the boss takedowns, to the beautifully animated EMMIs. I might not be a fan of them mechanically, but visually they're quite intimidating, even if the somewhat horrifying way they skewer Samus right through the face is a little let down by how she doesn't react at all. But to move on to something a little more positive, I'd like to take the time to compliment the music choices, which are far more restrained than their previous outing. Rather than just blast Lower Norfair whenever there's fire, there's a lot of new compositions, and they mostly sound great. There's nothing here that's quite as melodic as the tracks from Super or Fusion, or even Metroid 1, and there's nothing as excellently composed as the Prime soundtracks. But what we do have is competent in its own right, if perhaps lacking some of the uniqueness I would expect from Metroid. The best we get is probably the music surrounding the EMMI. It's weird and hectic and I really like it, but other than that, the music can kind of sound generic, which seems like kind of a harsh critique because that never really seemed to bother me. It's weird, I can't really say that it's better than okay, but I seem to enjoy it more than that comment suggests. I think it might be that it works better inside the game than out, when it's just backing that genericness doesn't really hit you as hard. Like when I played the game, I hear the theme for Caterus and it sounds alright, I'm thinking, yeah, I vibe with this. But then I listen to it outside the game and I go, Ooh, what the fuck is this? But for me, what did stick out is that thing that I mentioned before, composing new music. Samus Returns had a lot of remixed music, both from Metroid 2 and outside of it, and for the non-Metroid 2 music, it never really felt like its inclusion had a purpose. Using old music can work well, but it either needs to be used to tie motifs together, or be appreciably changed to have new meaning, and no, this room is hot does not count as a motif. No, Dread is not free of this trend either, perhaps being a touch too liberal with Samus's theme, or what I think is probably better described as the theme of Metroid, given how it's most often used to open and bookend the games. And then we also have this cutscene, which I see people really liking, and look, I hate to say it, but the shit fucking sucks. It is so incredibly counter to the environmental storytelling that Metroid is built upon, techniques that this game is not unfamiliar with. And music-wise, while its use of the theme of Super Metroid is probably the area in which it makes the most sense, its use of Red Brinstar, from what I can read into it, is legitimately just for nostalgia. But other than this one specific cutscene, the general lack of that kind of nostalgic music choice, especially during gameplay, and actually composing new music instead of reusing old ones with little justification, is what I think makes me enjoy this soundtrack more than I probably should. But to drag us back to the visuals, I think the decision to refine the 3D graphics might have been a little misguided, because what really stands out to me about the game's presentation is just how much fucking waiting there is. 3D graphics take up a vast quantity more memory than 2D sprites, and because of that, the game has to load each new area with these lengthy loading transitions, very much like Prime. It creates a feeling of disconnectedness that I'll come back to later, where Prime, and especially Prime 2, learn that because of the way the time waiting and the segmented map disconnects those areas, that it needed to treat them as more individual areas to explore, rather than one big world. Dread has you blasting all across the map like it's Super Metroid, which only makes this time loading stick out even more. But the thing is, do we even need this loading? This is a Metroidvania, where the area you interact with is comparatively very small, and you move into new areas with a very clear transition point. I mean, you could make the same comments about Prime, but that released on the GameCube. We're working with substantially more powerful hardware here. I don't even have to look far to find examples of much more impressive memory management on this same console. Fuck, on the console before, Breath of the Wild allows you to explore the entire fucking surface map with no transitional loading. I'm sure with all the help they got from the genre the game is in, they could have connected these areas without loading transitions. I mean, they did that exact feat on an SNES, and we're now working with 31,000 times the amount of available memory. Sure, some of that is now shared as video memory, but I'm still not sure that's really that difficult a technical challenge. Maybe the fade transitions between rooms might be a little bit longer, but I think if they took the time to make something a little more visually interesting than fade to blacks, that extra time wouldn't be that impactful. Plus, there's extra time spent fading to black for rooms with bosses in them, which is actually a hilarious detail that kind of ruins the surprise of a lot of smaller mini-bosses. Like, it'll take an extra second to load the room and you'll go, oh no, I wonder what's in there. Now, before I spiral into negativity, I think the main takeaway is that the game's presentation isn't bad. It's good, it's just somewhat stagnant, whereas I expected some improvement, not just in visual fidelity like we saw, but also in the technology that drives the game, which seems unchanged from Samus Returns, a title from the underpowered 3DS. Speaking of the map design, Metroid Dread's map is actually vastly different from the previous iterations, and much similar to how the first Metroid Prime was laid out. There are still differently themed areas, but rather than linking them together physically, like in Super Metroid, or having them mostly segmented, like in Fusion, they're connected by a bunch of elevators, trams, and teleporters, similar to how the first Metroid Prime separates its areas. And for the most part, it's alright. It has a decently sprawling layout that feels open-ended enough to promote decent exploration, but it might be a little bit too windy, I want to say. It can be a little bit frustrating to try and navigate some of these areas because while it all looks like one big block, the path to get to certain areas can often be more complex than is probably necessary. But on the whole, that's more of a minor complaint. What's much more impactful is the way that the map is segmented together. It doesn't have the benefit that Fusion had by fully embracing its linear structure and having each area accessible from the same place, nor the interconnectedness that a map like Super's had, where areas can interlock with each other in the same physical space. Instead, the map is almost networked together. The problem this mixes with though is that the map might be a little bit too big. Not too big for the player, but for the designers, and also not too big for the designers to handle. I think they've handled the map design in a way that makes navigation easy to follow, but too big for them to design it in a way that promotes player-driven exploration. The way Dread is laid out, you could almost describe as linear. Because the map is so large, it would be impossible for you to keep it all in your head at once, to know where you should use certain abilities if they're not close by, and so the exploration has to be very guided. That's what I mean by player-driven exploration. It's the kind of gameplay where it feels like you find where to go based on your own navigational skills. Dread's map is so big and too segmented that would be impossible. Trying to properly navigate the place unrestricted would be such a massive pain given its size, and how each of the areas don't exist in the same physical space. It's much more difficult to create a mental map of the place than, say, Super Metroid, so you have to be led through the game by the designers. Not in the way that Fusion does, although sometimes, yes, exactly the way Fusion does, but for the most part it's more by limiting the explorable area and making the path forward more obvious. That's why I say Dread doesn't have player-driven exploration. It definitely has exploration. You'll still feel like you're exploring ZDR, but it never feels like that exploration is being driven by you, the player, but rather by the game, as you'll basically just blindly stumble into exactly where you need to go. A mechanic that really exemplifies this is the teleporters. The teleporters, unlike in Samus Returns, are not used as the quick means of transport so that you can more easily navigate where you want to go. They only link two places together, and are really only used to shuttle you exactly where they want you to be. Like, for example, when you get the Morph Ball, one of the first Morph Ball entrances you will find will bump you right onto the red teleporter to Ataria, pretty much right where the Varia suit is. And once you've got it, you're forced through the teleporter because of these blocks, and the first hot room on the other side, which is right outside the teleporter room, and telegraphed to you before you take the teleporter, has the entrance to Kraid. And once you defeat Kraid, the diffusion beam immediately opens the door to the purple teleporter, which takes you straight to Darien, which is the next area you need to explore to get the bombs. Or another example, once you get the gravity suit, you immediately unlock an elevator to Ataria, which activates the planet cooldown event, which is one of the times the game tells you pretty much exactly where to go. And once you go there, clear out this boy, come back like you're told, find the screw attack, you then immediately unlock the blue teleporter that takes you to the next part of the game. In a way, this is really good design. The way forward is clear, but it's never told to you. It's intuited from the design itself. But it promotes a kind of linear structure that doesn't really gel with what I think the map is trying to be, especially later in the game. At the beginning, things are actually quite good. Limiting the exploration a bit is actually quite a good design choice. It's something that Super does up until you get the power bombs, but unlike Super, Dread really never opens up. Oh sure, the blocks they put in you slowly get removed, and you start to be able to explore most of the map, but you never have to. Because of how directed the critical path is, you never really have to think about where you're going, so anything behind you just kind of gets dumped from your memory. In Dread, you're always moving forward, even if the path is technically behind you. It's a type of forward momentum that works well for the action game I think Dread is becoming, but unlike Fusion, which completely reworked the objective structure and map design to fit its linear gameplay, Dread's map is still trying to make you feel like you're exploring on your own, but you never quite are. It's split between these two design philosophies, open-ended, player-driven exploration, and linear, tightly directed action. In a way, it's kind of split between its past two entries, but neither design can flourish when neither was given full focus. And to me personally, that's where the game really fell down. Now, I will argue that at this point, I'm in more personal subjective opinion territory. You might really like how the game combines its roots. In fact, you might prefer it, and honestly, I understand that. I would have liked an experience where it felt like I was the one finding the way forward. But others might not like to get lost and just want to get to whatever the fun stuff is to them. And this is where everyone yells at me about sequence breaks. And you know what? You're right, they're here, and it's fucking sick that they're here. I just wish that the game had been designed in a way that made me want to find them. It's a subtle distinction, and one I think the game is partially on both sides for, because a lot of the sequence breaks were actually designed into the game, the most obvious being the bombs before Kraid, but there are some other ones like early gravity and early space jump that were clearly intended as well. You were nudged a little bit into finding sequence breaks, I won't deny that, but the fact I never bothered to find any is telling. I love sequence breaking, and regularly broke sequence on my first playthrough of Super, but because the path is so directed, finding alternate routes is actually more effort than just running through the critical path, especially near the beginning. Early grapple beam into early bombs is actually a really good example, because getting the grapple beam requires the Varia suit, and because the game railroads you straight to Kraid after you get the Varia suit, it's actually more out of the way to go get bombs before Kraid than it is just to fight him right now. What's most telling is that's exactly what speedruns do. They do get early grapple, but they just fight Kraid normally because this bomb trick is more out of the way. Things are actually quite a bit better nearer the end of the game, but the way the final objective is gated by story progression means that it can't ever quite reach the heights of shit like reverse boss order. That's not awful, mind you, just an observation. I do really like how gravity, space jump and screw attack can all be collected in any order that you want, provided you know how to shine spark. That was the kind of stuff I really wish I was kind of pushed towards more. Again, what's done in the speedruns is telling. The only other sequence breaks I can see are early screw attack into early space jump and late storm missiles to cut down on some backtracking. Don't quote me on that though, I'm not a part of the speedrunning community, so I can't speak to exactly what is done and why. This is kind of insane to say, because the game is very generous with how it lets you snap it in half, but that idea of having you do that isn't reflected in the base design of the game. It's so directed that I never bothered. Contrast that to my first playthrough of Super, where I broke sequence without even realizing it, specifically because the map's structure, not only in what they allowed, but also in the very design of the standard map progression, pushed me towards doing that. Dread lets you, and in some ways it does encourage you, but it never really pushes you to, which means, at least to me, that these sequence breaks don't change how I feel about the game's structure all that much. However, I am definitely glad that they're there, make no mistake about that. And again, it's important to note, this map isn't badly designed, it's actually excellently designed. It just promotes a style of exploration that I'm not fond of. But onto something I can talk about far more overtly positively, because the stuff you actually do in this map is really great. Puzzles and secret design, how you actually obtain these items, has been greatly considered, and aside from all the combat loops, it's the best part of the gameplay. The speed booster especially is used to great effect, much like in Zero Mission. When I got the speed booster, all I thought was, oh cool, they didn't leave it out this time. And then I used the fucking thing. I was grinning from ear to ear. It's that fucking fun. The speed booster has never been animated with this much oomph before. The sudden stops when turning around, the way it kicks in, the shine spark just fucking launching you, oh my god, it's so good. But off the tangent, I was surprised at how willing the game is to put you in situations that are harshly affected by power-ups that you don't actually have yet. For example, water. Dread is very willing to just dump you into water long before you ever find the gravity suit. The main water sections you traverse through are mostly done without it, and there are several progression gates in water sections before you get the gravity suit. The spin boost and the space jump, while being very similar abilities, are also used to progress through water sections before the gravity suit comes into play. It makes the suit a more impactful collect because you know how much easier it's making these sections, which is an element that both the past games struggle with, fearing that they can't make the underwater sections with the more limited movement compelling enough to make up for that more limited movement. There's also a couple more power-ups, which, if I'm honest, was actually kind of a surprise. I wasn't sure if they'd add anything more. Sure, the storm missiles might just be the Seeker missiles from Prime 2, right down to the 5 missile door unlocks, but they've been upgraded to be actually useful in combat, which is nice. And then the cross bombs and the diffusion beam are wholly original to my knowledge, although the former doesn't affect progression as much as I'd like, and the latter doesn't affect combat as much as I'd like, given it is a beam upgrade. It's in these elements where the game really shines. In the moment-to-moment gameplay, how these items are used to create barriers that you need to overcome, how they affect combat and change your strategies, make for very interesting and compelling gameplay. My favourite part of the game was the late game cleanup, which is odd for someone like me who usually doesn't much care for sections like that, but the puzzles for a lot of the optional items are so well designed that it actually becomes more fun than the critical path gameplay. The way the puzzles have been crafted to not only just test your skill, but also to test your knowledge, seeing if you can figure out how to combine your abilities to solve these challenges is great. There's a temptation to just lock items behind a locked door that you can only open with a specific power-up, but all that does is reward you for coming back through whatever area the item is locked in. When you need to use multiple items in creative ways, and also require mechanical prowess, you have much more interesting gameplay that not only extrinsically motivates you with the promise of player progression, but also intrinsically motivates you with interesting challenges to overcome, and therefore make for much better puzzles. And what's also great is you never have to hunt around to find where these items are. Because, right, a puzzle is something that you have all the information for, or have the ability to get all the information for, but you don't know how that information fits together. Finding something just by sheer chance, or by firing a missile and a bomb at every out-of-place wall, combing each room for any secrets, is not a puzzle. It's busy work, because you're not actually thinking about where the stuff is. A combination of the scan pulse, one of the best bits of design from Samus Returns, alongside the map telling you the general area of hidden power-ups, means that this is never a necessary option. You'll always know where items items are, just not how to get to them. That's a part of Super Metroid's design that I think isn't quite as polished as its legendary stature. There's a lot of stuff here that's not just hidden, but hidden without any method of finding it other than guessing and checking. And Dread's puzzles might give you more information, but it's usually not enough to spell out the solution outright, and even if it is, there's usually also a skill check alongside the knowledge check, so you really feel like you're just being handed these upgrades, despite how easy it's been made to find the physical location that they reside in. But it does mean you'll never have to blindly hunt around to find optional upgrades. Bombing every wall is not a thing you'll ever think about doing in this game. There's also some more general moment-to-moment stuff I'd like to touch on, specifically the new movement. I've already mentioned the dash, but there are also a couple other new moves, like the spider grapple and the slide, which all get neatly integrated into progression in some fun ways. The slide particularly turns bits of the map that would normally stop you dead in your tracks to transfer into the morph ball into gaps that you can just breeze right through, and even once you get the morph ball, its ability to still quickly go through small gaps or launch you partway through a morph ball track is always useful. What I'm not a big fan of though is the still nerfed wall jump. We've got the wall jump from Fusion still, that kicks you out a considerable distance to stop you from being able to sequence break some areas. The problem with this though is that it has to lock you into an arc to do it, taking control away in a way that the rest of the control scheme tries to avoid. A more improved wall jump could have made vertical traversal, which can be a bit of a pain, much improved. It doesn't really have the excuse of trying to stop sequence breaking anymore, both because of how many sloped surfaces there are already in the game that they could have used to prevent it, and because they aren't so actively trying to stop you from sequence breaking anymore. The spider grapple plays into this as well, but only mildly. Because they expect you to be able to vertically climb these, they turn off the wall jumps forced arc, which is a nice touch, and it's great for not having to agonizingly crawl up these, but it only works on straight, vertical surfaces, any kind of diagonal or horizontal plane, and then you've got to slowly inch your way across. It's for that reason that vertical movement can sometimes be very fluid and fun, but also sometimes jarringly unrefined and far too unpredictable given how often vertical movement is used in EMMI zones. The 360-degree aiming from Samus Returns as well still can be a little finicky given that the sensitivity changes based on how far away something is, and stuff that's quite far away can be a bit of a bitch to hit. There might also be a little bit too many combinations of buttons to activate abilities, nothing you can't get used to with practice, but the grapple beam especially with a button to activate it, aim it, and fire it being of note is something I misfired all the fucking time. But other than that, game is good, yeah? This, I think, should be the main takeaway. For all my gripes with its structure, I cannot say that Dread isn't fun to play. It's been tightly designed so that your ever-expanding arsenal gets used in fun and creative ways. I just have issues with the more broad structure. I've probably come off quite negative during this, and that's why I really need to stress. Metroid Dread is a good game. Its action is great, its exploration is easy to follow, and it's generally polished. A lot of you will probably play it and think it's incredible, and that's not because you're naive or anything, but that your priorities might be a little different from mine. I was expecting something new and innovative, and maybe that's not fair for a series dormant for 19 years. My introduction to Metroid was in 2016, so I haven't exactly had to wait as long as many other people have. So just having a new Metroid game isn't much of a seller for me. So to really answer the question, does Metroid Dread get to proclaim itself as Metroid 5? Well, that's not up to me to answer. That's a personal question, up to each person that plays it, their relationship and history with the series. To some, it's a triumphant return for a series in hibernation, so, shit, it's Metroid 5. But to me, what Metroid's always been about, aside from the obvious shit, is focus. The series' willingness to double down on each title's core focus, from the cold and empty Metroid 2 to the way Fusion systematically removes all of the player's freedoms to align with Samus's own restrictions, is a kind of confidence not really seen anymore. And to me, it's what sets the Metroid series apart from the rest of the Metroidvania genre. Dread doesn't feel that way to me. It never seems to really nail down what it wants to be, whether that's a linear action platformer with some exploration, a tense and somewhat horror-inspired take on Metroid, or a retread of Super's iconic game design. This lack of focus, of core direction, is what leads me to think of it separate from the rest of the 2D series. Each game before it was unique, and tries to do something new and different with the medium of game design. Metroid was about creating a new type of exploration gameplay within the restraints of the time. Metroid 2 was about making you feel the cold, merciless act of committing genocide, not in spite of, but by using the limitations of the Game Boy. Super Metroid was about taking the knowledge and power gained in the 4th generation of consoles and refining the exploration gameplay created in the first game to an impeccable standard. and Metroid Fusion was about taking a more directed linear approach to that exploration gameplay, to focus more on action, world and atmosphere, as well as to better fit the handheld medium. The only thing Dread is about, the only thing that it accomplishes, is being another Metroid game. It has some elements in there that could have made it unique if the design was more focused. The tension and dread that the game is named after, the action and combat, the untapped potential to create a world unrestricted by technical limitations. It's good. I enjoyed playing it, but the only thing it did to be unique was to make me disappointed. Oh boy, some of you are not gonna like that conclusion, are you? I mean, it's whatever, right? I have, what, like 900 odd subscribers? I can still say whatever the fuck I want and no one will care, right? But on a more serious note, if you did enjoy the game and you don't agree with my analysis, don't let me stop you from enjoying it. I'm just an idiot with stupid opinions, and I hope I've demonstrated clearly enough that my problems with the game are my problems, and it's okay if you don't have those problems. But also, that those problems they do exist, they are real. I'm not just talking straight out of my ass. See, look, fucking Mark Brown agrees with me, even if he did steal some of my points. I fucking wrote the script before he released that video, you fucking bitch. This was a pretty difficult game to write about. I don't know if you can tell, hopefully not, but there were a lot of edits to the script made, like, even after it was shot. Like, there was an entire section on the shortcomings of the narrative that got cut because I felt it was needlessly negative. And then also there were a bunch of edits to the script that I made during editing, because over time my opinion of the game generally kind of softened. I don't know, I'm pretty sure I'm like venting now. I mean, I've seen the analytics. I know like 20 people are gonna see to this part of the video, but it's like, it kind of seems like I'm the sole voice of dissent on this one, which is difficult to kind of stand by your opinions when everyone seems to contradict them. I mean, it's not like my opinions haven't been challenged in a good way as well. I mean, original drafts of the script were much more negative, if you can believe that. And I tried to add some more positive stuff, as I kind of found that there were parts of the game that I did enjoy quite a lot, but none of it really overcame the feeling that the unfocused direction resulted in a game that isn't quite as tight as the past Metroid games. I mean, well, you made it this far into the video, so I guess you must not think that I'm talking directly out of my ass. Or you could be watching out of vindictive hatred. Either way, I do hope you enjoyed. And as for the names you're about to see, fuck, I love you guys. And if the rest of you want to figure out why I love them so much, find out yourself. I'm not ready for the public release of that until I have, you know, some amount of time to make these videos, because right now I absolutely don't. So I'll see you in another 3 months.